But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
Coming to you live from within a windy and now less icy and occasionally more sunny, but still quite cold, radioactive meme land. We are the survivors of the alt-right apocalypse, the few, the brave, the bitchy, once more wading into battle against the lobster hordes with Rantzerker 113. And I don't even know the title of this one.
What is and isn't toxic masculinity?
Oh, what is and isn't?
It's everything. It's everything. It is all things.
You know what I think the real question is? Who does and doesn't get to determine which types of behavior defines masculinity and which types of behavior are unacceptable? I think that's the real question. In which case, I would say it's more of a question of toxic ideology. But let's continue.
I think I know the answer. I think I know the answer to that question. Obviously, it's the people. It's the people that are making this video. They know exactly what the problem is. They've identified it. They know that it lies within a vertical hierarchy structure built by men and reinforced by men. And that is the thing that needs to be dismantled because capitalism. And I know that sounds really ridiculous, but it's absolutely not. So
it's not ridiculous in terms of its influence.
In terms of it's no, not at all. No. But I'm saying in terms of like some of the logical leaps that are being made in this video.
I just want to point out one more thing. You know while these ideologies get to define masculinity, I don't necessarily think women should have the right to define masculinity, but nowhere in there is masculinity as defined by women's preferences. And nowhere in this entire discussion is an acknowledgement of how women prefer men to be and how that might have an influence on men. And, if women decided that they preferred men who are capable of carving elaborate flutes, how quickly we would see if a flutist racing, I don't know, flutist, carve your flute.
Yeah.
Flautists?
Flautist. Sorry. Flautist. Apologies. Flautist. Yeah. How quickly we would see flautist carving races and flautist meets and flautist universities and flautist CEOs and flautist everywhere. But never a discussion of that part of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, sexual selection isn't at all part of the environment, social or otherwise, and it is not part of natural selection. So, Alison, check your thinking there.
Yeah, check it. We don't want dead air. This isn't some other channel where there's a lot of dead air. So before we get into this,
are you casting shade, dude? Are you casting shade?
I don't know what you're talking
and then you
about.
Like silent, Alison.
No, I was checking my thinking. I was doing what you told me to do.
Oh my God!
About the head and neck.
She was using the thinky part of her head. So before we get into this, I watched this video and I timestamped several points. It's 20 minutes long. It is from a channel called Renegade Cut, and it is entitled "What Is and Is Not Toxic Masculinity." And I've noticed a growing trend. So there's been like a kind of new, I'm not brand new, but back when we used to do response videos, most of the time the videos we were responding to were, and a lot of other, maybe not just only, clearly not limited to us, but lots of other people that made sort of response videos to feminist videos on the internet were essentially responding to overall low-hanging fruit. A lot of it was a teenage girl in her bedroom. That's sort of like how we described it. That's just like, I like equality or whatever, right? But now that it's been, that level of argumentation has been pretty thoroughly smashed, then for a while, we, sort of anti-feminist or anti-SJW content was, really popular, right? Reason, facts, logic, and evidence, owning the libs or whatever, trigger the libs. Well, now there's a new kind of, feminist / leftist YouTube culture that's rising up, and it's a lot more intellectually, it appears to be intellectually robust, okay? And in that it doesn't come across as, this is about the optics and the packaging more than the arguments, but the arguments are expanded on. The packaging appears to be more professional. The people presenting them are trying to be a lot less emotional and a lot less,
perky.
Yeah,
Perky.
right. It's just a different way of presenting it. And if you're somebody who doesn't think a whole lot about the way the arguments are being presented, and you really you don't think about the arguments themselves, but you think about more in terms of like how they're being presented, then you might fall for the trap of essentially thinking that because it's being presented in a way that appears academic, then that means that it must be true, or that there is some truth in it. And one of the really tricky things about making arguments against feminist doctrine is that it does take things that are true and it uses them to make gigantic lies. And you have to, you cannot underestimate that, and you can't dismiss that. And as an example, I watched this video, and it's a very good example of what I mean. There is a lot of stuff in the video that's true, but there is a lot more that's completely glossed over, ignored altogether, and otherwise sort of like dismissed, right? Because it works from essentially a religious perspective, and it's filling in the gaps. It's essentially the patriarchy of the gaps in terms of how the arguments are made. But for, people who don't really think about this stuff, for normies that just might be exposed to this or just seeing it, they think it sounds really legit. And it's something that you cannot underestimate. And I bring that up because I've been feeling lately myself really frustrated with the level of argumentation coming from people that I, respect as a sort of anti-feminist or at least critical of feminism or whatever, where they don't do enough, or they act like it's a joke, or they don't think it's important to really drill down on the arguments and just really look at them and take them seriously instead of dismissing them. And because you're giving strength to the other side because they get to say that you're being dishonest or you're being dismissive or whatever, and you're not actually addressing the problem. Big Joel, who he made like a video response to, a stream response to a while back when he made his video about the Red Pill movie. He made a video a few weeks back talking about Anita Sarkeesian. It was like maybe a couple weeks ago. And it was basically says to the people who are Anita Sarkeesian, the people who hate her, or something like that, right? And it was responding to Thunderfoot, Sargon, and even the Amazing Atheist arguments from years back. Sargon responded to it, but he responded to it in a way that was overly dismissive. And he made arguments, but the problem is that he didn't drill down enough on them. And so Big Joel made another response video to that today, which could have been, well, I wouldn't say it was avoidable because these people are going to make whatever they're going to make, but it does mean that Big Joel is doing the work to make the arguments that Sargon's not making, or he's not doing that work because he doesn't think it's important. For example, and this is another thing that I think is important to point out, and I know we haven't even gotten to the video yet, but this is just something that's been on my mind. When Gamergate was going on, there were people that were saying, a lot of people in Gamergate were saying, we need to ignore Anita Sarkeesian. We need to dismiss her. She's not important. If we give her focus, it makes her more powerful. Blah, 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 right? It's not important what she's doing, or we need to focus on the ethics part and dismiss the fact that there are people bringing their ideological sledgehammers into these spaces that were built and sustained and funded mostly by men that just want to enjoy their pastime. And I said back then, the problem, and there were a lot of other people, so I'm not the only one. The problem isn't the ethics. The problem isn't necessarily specifically Anita. The problem is the ideology. If you don't go after that, you're never going to stop this. It's just you're either someone else is going to take over and keep going, or Anita's going to continue to grow, whether you give her attention or not. And sure enough, she did get ignored. And by all accounts, most people would think that she fell into obscurity because Feminist Frequency is a small channel now, and she's not producing the content that she supposedly promised on her Kickstarter or whatever. And so one would think that she must be gone, but that's absolutely not true. She's just working. Yeah, she's working in the real world, actually making things different. She's actually talking to game developers like Ubisoft and EA and Activision. She got a room in Facebook named after her at the Facebook headquarters. She is affecting social media, the internet, gaming, all kinds of other cultures. Just because she's not on YouTube making content doesn't mean that she doesn't absolutely have power. She was like taking selfies with Joss Whedon. I mean, this is not something that you can outright dismiss. And another thing that's very important is that even then, in these sort of pop culture spaces, that's just the beginning. Ultimately, she wants political power, whether it's through her directly or through people that she's influenced. And it's not another thing is it's not just her. That's just one person. It's the ideology itself. It will infect other people who already are just sort of like inclined to go along with it anyway, and they're just going to bring that into their shit. And so it's really frustrating because it's just the way feminism works. It's so funny because it's something that people may not like, but they also don't take it seriously. And they just say, well, I don't like that stuff, but I mean, what are they going to do? It's just a bunch of angry lesbians with hairy armpits crying in there.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of kooks. It's just a bunch of women. Yeah. It's just a bunch of girls. Right. And how big a threat can they be?
Yes. And without admitting or without acknowledging the fact that they are educating people in schools. Now they're educating people online. They're involved in everything. Everything that we try to do, there's feminism, no matter where you go. And that's by design. That's on purpose. So
actually, it doesn't even require any conscious effort. It just requires the removal or the sudden absence. In order to suck a whole volume of liquid into something, all you need to do is create a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge vacuum that feminism is filling. Now that's another story for another day, but it doesn't even require conscious effort or a conspiracy. It just requires that we have a central narrative in society that suddenly disappeared and something has to replace it. And so happens that feminism is primed and right to get right in there, get right into that void, fill all those little capillaries. Mm-hmm. But and it is frustrating when people say, well, why don't you just ignore them and they'll go away? No, they won't. And the action, the simple osmotic pressure that's going on here, that feminism is filling a void of a problem that we failed to address 150 years ago. The feminism is now leaking into the void left from the end of a belief system that we needed to keep our society running, which is we've never really had a society without a central belief in a God, in a monotheistic God, at least in the West, which controls our behavior, gives us all a sense of belonging, gives us all the same kind of morality. And I'm not a Christian and I'm not really religious, but I recognize the role that God played. And it was necessary to have that idea of this omnipresent, omnipotent deity judging our behavior in order to make people engage with each other in a responsible and moral way. And we've yet to figure out how to continue to keep people to engage with each other in a sense of fellowship and in moral and responsible way without that concept. And feminism, unfortunately, is a very poor replacement. And the reason why it's a poor replacement, I cover in my video, The Curse of the Catabolic Feminine. Feminism at its core is about women being weak and being victims. And when women present themselves as weak and victims in such a pervasive, all-encompassing way, like that is the definition of being female, is to be weak, to be victims, to be acted upon by society, they elicit in men, in every man that narrative touches, the desire to identify and destroy the enemy. Mm-hmm. So we are pumping out this mythology that women are utter victims of society, and in response, men are dropping into this instinctive desire to identify the enemy, they're ending up in extremist ideologies that give them an unending stream of enemies, identify for them an unending stream of enemies, and there's no way you can get them to to come together, to cooperate, to create the structures of society that we rely on when you're pumping out this much catabolic, what I call catabolic feminine, which is the
Okay.
breaking down.
Okay. Hey, can we actually watch the video?
All right.
Well, one
Yeah.
thing before we start, one thing.
Okay.
Before we start, before we wood chipper our way through this ideology, remember, folks, for those listening, those who don't understand the word that we've said, you think that Brian is a conspiracy theorist and I'm a lunatic. Patriarchy theory, as feminists posit it, have said it is not proven. It has never been proven. Well, it has been tested and found faulty and wrong. Patriarchy theory is false. It's simply false. It's the theory that society, with a choice to benefit men or a choice to benefit women, would prefer to benefit men, would prefer to provide men food, would prefer to provide men shelter, would prefer to provide men security and safety over women. Now, intuitively, you understand that what I've said is ridiculous because we judge men based on whether they provide security, food, and shelter for women. So we know it's ridiculous to posit that we live in a society that prefers to benefit men over women, that would prefer to see harm done to women rather than men. It's on its face ridiculous. And it's also a concept that has never been proven and has a substantial body of evidence to indicate that it is completely and utterly false. So remember, everything he says is premised on a concept that is unscientific and can consider basically just a religious belief at this point.
Yeah.
And not even a religious belief, because religious beliefs generally can't be proven. This has been proven false. Patriarchy theory, as feminists imagine it, is false.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just read the super chats and then we'll set up the first clip. So Ben gives us $3. Thank you, Ben, and says Alison. That's it. Just says Alison. And I think his icon, his little icon, looks kind of like a vagina on fire, but I'm not sure. French Honey Badger gives us $5 and says, "Are you going to review Big Joel's video at all? Just curious. No, not today. That video is a fucking half hour. I just watched it today and I sent it to Sargon." And he said he'll watch it later. But I was watching it. I'm just basically expressing my feelings because I watched it and it was really frustrating and he was really weaselly. And the problem is that the arguments needed to be addressed in such a way that, you know, you take it seriously, even if it's really stupid. You take it seriously, even if you don't think it's important, so that they can't respond. So, I mean, like that they don't have a counter argument. Anyway, so let's get into the first clip. This is basically talking about toxic masculinity. I have it reversed because I'm trying to like avoid the copyright. So there isn't a lot of written words. This just says what is and is not toxic masculinity. So you guys know.
Masculinity is a set of attributes, values, and behaviors associated with being a man. It is a social construct that is distinct from biological sex. The term toxic masculinity refers to a specific societal expectation of men that is enforced and policed by men.
Okay, pausing for the... Go ahead.
All right. Well, then this is irrelevant because there is no societal version of masculinity that is policed and enforced by men alone.
By men alone. No,
yeah, you can't extract the influence of women from this. And the fact that you are trying to suggest that you are definitely looking at this through a lens of ideology.
Yeah.
Like the one of the other things that premise their thinking on, one of the other things that feminists premise their thinking on is that men and women don't exist in a dynamic, but exist in a state of war, of separate warring camps, rather than a dynamic in which both influence each other. Okay, go ahead, Karen.
No, I bring this up all the time when it comes to, you know, things like, you know, criticizing Naomi Wolf regarding her beauty myth, you know, sort of premise, right? And, you know, sort of eating disorders and the fashion industry and the wrinkle cream industry and, you know, all of these industries that women buy into, diet industry. Well, yeah, men do set the criteria upon which women compete with each other, right? So men generally prefer women who look young, who look healthy, symmetrical, who have an hourglass figure, who have that ideal waist to hip ratio. These are the criteria that set they are decided by men, right? And women compete on that, right? Clear skin, all of that stuff, large eyes, higher degrees of neoteny, and the facial features and all of that stuff, right? Men set those criteria, but then you can't say that men are to blame for the beauty industry, that men are to blame for the billions of dollars that are being pumped into fashion and cosmetics and anti-aging creams and all of this stuff, right? Plastic surgery and all of that stuff. They're not to blame for it, because women can, or they have the option of just not competing, right?
Yeah.
Based on those criteria, right? And so you can't isolate the one from the other, right? Men may set the criteria by which women compete, right? But women actually have to go into competition with each other, right? That is there are two agents at work here, right? One is men and one is women, right? And it's the same with toxic masculinity, right? If women reward men who behave in toxically masculine ways with, the brass ring of reproductive opportunity, right? If that's what women are rewarding men for, then of course men are going to behave in toxically masculine ways, right? And even with that, and one of the things I'm going to bring up yet fucking again, right? The conformity to masculine norms inventory, Mahalik, right? Okay. It lists Playboy as a fundamental aspect of normative masculinity, not toxic masculinity, mind you, normative masculinity. So getting laid a lot, right? And it cites when he wrote a paper essentially describing how he came up with this inventory, that aspect of masculinity that he describes as normative, he cites a book in which 1% of men said that this was the most important aspect of their masculinity, was to be sexually successful with women. 1% of men. Now, 30% of men said the most fundamental aspect of their masculine identity was being a faithful partner, right? 30% of men said a fundamental aspect of their masculine identity, the most fundamental aspect of their masculine identity, was being nurturing, right? Neither of those made it on the inventory. What made it onto the inventory of what is considered normative masculinity is that 1% of men that said getting laid a lot by lots of different women is the primary fundamental aspect, the most important thing in their minds in terms of their masculine identity, right? That's on the masculine norms inventory, but being a faithful partner is not, and neither is being nurturing.
Okay, I just wanted to get in there and just to respond to two of your points, Karen, because there was interesting. You said that men set the criteria by which women's beauty ideal is judged, but women have to go into competition with each other. And I just wanted to point out that actually, if you look at how women's beauty ideal changes over time, women are the ones who set the standard, at least in terms of thinness or athleticness, and then a generation later, men have adopted the standard set essentially by their mothers. So there's a huge influence even there, women influencing men's beauty ideal. And you can tell, just look around the world.
Well, but
those cultures where women are expected to be more independent, you see this more athletic, thin beauty ideal. Whereas in those cultures where women expect to be homemakers or more taken care of, you still see that sort of voluptuous, more feminine beauty ideal.
Yes,
It's
but you know what? But you know what you don't see. You don't see ever, despite the body positivity movement, the fat positivity movement, the anti-fat phobia, everything. Right? What you don't see ever, and you will never see, is men or women, uh, sort of en masse, adopting an aesthetic that a woman whose waist is bigger than her hips
yeah,
is the ideal. You're
granted.
never going to see that. You're never going to see that, and it's
And there's
because
actually even
that
sort
is
of
that is the
evolutionary reasons for that
yeah,
beyond
there
just
is.
the health
Because
and the
men,
fertility.
yes,
It's
because men,
because we're predators, and predators have narrow waists.
there you go. And also because men set those standards, and that is one line that they will not be pushed back away from. They will not be pushed back away from that by all of the freaking Trigglypuffs in the world demanding that men find her attractive. Men are not going to be able to do that. And so there is a certain amount of cultural leeway, right? In terms of, does being thin as a woman, right, and athletic mean that you work in the fields and are a serf, or does it mean that you're so wealthy you can afford a personal trainer,
The other
right?
thing I
And to
wanted to
eat
talk about
something other than potatoes and Doritos, right?
that you
So
were saying, this is sort of a digression, Karen. So the other thing I wanted to talk about that you had brought up is that their definition of normative masculinity is based not actually on what men say is important to them, but their own vision of what they think is important to men, which actually really only, like, the individual talking today really is only talking about what he thinks about his masculinity and the masculinity of men around him. And it's incredibly negative, which
oh yeah,
actually speaks to that idea that we are inducing the state in men to identify other men as the enemy.
well
And
I
that's not going to end well.
I found it hilarious because Kathy Young, like, as much as you and I have had disagreements with her opinions in the past and stuff like that. One of the things she mentioned about the APA guidelines, which uses the Mahalik inventory, right? She said, I think there are a whole bunch of conservative religious men in the United States who would maybe question the idea that promiscuity on the part of men is a masculine norm imposed on men by other men, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that they might take issue with that. But when I went and I because I did some searching online in terms of all of that, and Teal Deer did a series of videos on the conformity to masculine norms, and then the later Mahalik conformity to feminine norms inventory, right? He did some looking into it. And okay, here's the thing, right? Mahalik defined masculine norms as the normative roles and behaviors that are imposed on people, on men in Western cultures by middle and upper class privileged white men. Okay, so this is a white man thing. Okay, these are the norms chosen by white men to enforce on all other men. Okay, but who were his? He essentially developed this inventory um, by posing it to his graduate students, right? Posing the issue. Let's try and figure out what these norms are to his graduate students. And who were his graduate students? They were 5 women, 1 man of color, and 3 white men. Okay. All right. And then after they developed this list, right, then they presented it to some focus groups that were a little bit more diverse, right? But you're looking at this thing where 5 women have decided what masculine norms are, right? The normative masculine behaviors expected of men in our culture, particularly as imposed by white men, right? And only 3 of those people were white men, right? Out of the 9, which is a tiny fucking minuscule sample size, please. I mean, let's just look at that, right? And it was just like kind of a soundboarding session. It was kind of like a, let's bounce ideas off of each other, right? And I guarantee you, nurturing didn't get in there. Being a faithful partner didn't get in there because they're not exclusively masculine, right? They're not exclusively masculine. So therefore, they are not expectations that we place on men, right? And so what you have is a situation where masculine virtues are culled out of the list because women can be faithful, and we expect women to be faithful, and we expect women to be nurturing, and we also expect women to maybe be brave in some circumstances, and all of these things. So all of these masculine virtues, right, that we really place on men as expectations, right? What we have is a situation where a lot of those virtues were culled out because there are also things that we think that women are perfectly capable of, equally capable of, as men are, and so they can't be coded masculine, right?
But they're expected more from men. To be honest.
Of course they are. Of course they are. Right?
Not expected as in people expect men to have these virtues by virtue of being men, but that they are judged more harshly if they don't fall on the sword for their partner, jump in the bullet, make sure she has shelter and food, and make sure that she's emotionally satisfied and emotionally and sexually. All of these things are expectations that we put on men.
Well, the only one that made it in, the only one of those that made it in was breadwinner, right?
And
breadwinner made it in, and why did it make it in? Because women don't feel any expectation to be the breadwinner,
which is huge. That is a huge amount of emotional labor that men do for women, not to mention the physical labor. But everything that you're saying, Karen, every single bit of it.
But just let me finish. Let me finish, because Mahalik then a couple of years later decided to do an inventory for femininity, right? Conformity to feminine norms inventory. And guess what his sounding board group was comprised of? All women.
Women.
All women.
But here's the thing. When I started this, I said, or part of what I said was, this is all based on terrible science. Actually, it's even beyond it's science so bad it can't even be called alchemy. This is terrible. All of it. The presumption of patriarchy. We live in a society that wants to benefit. It wants to get shelter, provide shelter. It wants to wrap men in a cozy blanket of comfort while it deprives women and shoves them out in the snow to carry out the garbage and shovel the walk. That's what our society wants, is according to feminist theory. And that's been proven false repeatedly. And they never, ever acknowledge that fact. They just blunder forward with this complete lie. And then this science, which is masculine norms determined by 5 women, 1 man of color, and 3 men. So 5 women and 4 men, all of whom probably don't like masculinity much because let's face it, they're psychology graduates. They probably think we have one gender and an abnormal adaptation to being human. So we have woman and an abnormal adaptation to being human, which is masculine. So, but this is such bad science. It's so bad it can't even be called anything approaching science. It can't even be called alchemy, for God's sake. And this is what they base all of their theories on. This is what this guy bases his theory on. Let us hear some more from him, though.
Okay, so a couple things before we continue. I got super chats, but I also wanted to say...
No super chats. Let's get further into this. We'll do the super chats after like halfway through or something.
All right, okay. All right, so the other thing I wanted to say is that I don't even agree that masculinity is a social construct if It is something that has evolved to the place that it is now because women sexually selected men for the traits that they considered to be good enough that they wanted to reproduce with those men. Then that, I don't think, if you call that socially constructed, then I think it's sort of irreversible in that light. And you can only blame one group of people for that, and that'd be women, because they're picking the men. So,
And the funny thing is that they haven't picked men that they're that bad. But let's Karen.
no,
let's
no,
just
they
get into it.
haven't.
Let's
No,
do
they
some more
haven't.
videos.
But you also have to understand that social behavior is also biological in part, right? It's not arbitrary.
No,
right?
I'm saying it's the idea that it's socialized or socially constructed is bullshit, because you can't socially construct a way of being like what masculine means. That's, men are just men, and women, when they select men, they select them for certain traits that, you know, they exhibit, the physical as well as the way that they sort of perform in the world, and then that essentially improves their odds of making babies, which will include men that will continue that cycle, because those men will be sexually successful, and so on. And so I'm not even talking about necessarily blaming, because like Alison said, you know, the good, probably mostly the best men are the ones that got to reproduce, mostly. And so what we have now is a society that is probably as good as it can be. And even if there's something negative, we can't go back. So it's sort of a moot point anyway. All right, so maybe I'll jump ahead a bit, because it's already like 40 minutes in, and it's a long video. So he does open up with the first like 8 minutes or so explaining, you know, various kinds of counter arguments that he would normally get. Let's just jump into when he starts talking about Conan the Barbarian. How's that? You guys familiar with Conan?
Yes,
I'm very familiar with Conan. Okay, so we're gonna go to 7:15. Here we go.
Conan the Barbarian. In Conan the Barbarian, young Conan's parents are slaughtered by the forces of Thulsa Doom. Conan becomes a slave, but his strenuous physical exercise eventually transforms himself into Arnold Schwarzenegger. He becomes a gladiator, then a thief, and then exacts revenge on Thulsa Doom and his serpent cult. Conan...
Okay, pausing for the banana. He's basically using Conan to explain toxic masculinity, so this is why we're talking about this.
So like the dude that saves everyone from the serpent cult is toxically masculine.
Yes.
Well, the other thing is that he was a slave. He was an orphaned at a young age, became a slave, was forced to do labor for decades, and what the real issue is that other men taught him to be this? No, the real issue is that he's part of an incredibly savage and barbaric society.
Oh, that's not important. That's not important.
I don't even understand this. Why would you use Conan the Barbarian to say anything about,
I have
the accountant, the Todd in accounting? Like, seriously.
I have an idea as to why, and you'll find out in a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's keep going.
Serpent cult. Conan was not born violent, but he was taught by his father that the only thing he can trust is his sword, and the circumstances of his life, a system of enslavement, hardened him and made him the violent barbarian. Men are not born with toxic attitudes or born violent.
No. Okay, men are not born with toxic attitudes. They have to be violently enslaved and subject to a father's teaching who is aware that society is a violent enslavement system. So he teaches his son, this is how you survive in the shithole that we exist in. That wasn't the father forcing the norms on his son. It's the society forcing the norms on his father, and this father saying, okay, I want my kid to fucking survive. I want him to live.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give him the skills that he needs to live. And then society forcing slavery on Conan. How is this in any way something
I honestly think that Conan the Barbarian would have been a much better movie if he'd just been like, okay, so he just, he escaped from slavery because some SJW cut his bonds. and then he just like went on to play video games and collect welfare.
Okay,
All
yeah.
right. So yeah, let's continue.
They are taught by others explicitly, or taught implicitly through social interactions with other men that express this narrow form of masculinity. These social systems are not literally pushing the wheel of pain endlessly until it makes you hard and unfeeling, but, well, it's a pretty solid metaphor, right?
Yeah, it's a solid metaphor for your bullshit beliefs about other men. My God, like, why don't you drop, like, just put down the catabolic feminine, the drugs of catabolic femininity, like the belief that women are always a victim of something, so you have to constantly find evil men everywhere, and realize your problem, guy, is your attitude to others men, your xenophobia towards other men. This is a fantasy film about a brutal reality. It has nothing to do with anything that men teach each other in our reality. Well, I mean, maybe a little bit. If you're don't have a father and you live in a situation where your best prospect is to join a gang and kill another man, so you can eventually have some kind of relationship. And yes, statistically, killing killing another man is a way that disenfranchised boys who were raised without fathers are able to gain the social credit to have access to relationships. That's statistically true. It is one of the pieces of science that feminism refuses to look at because it's too much science for them. So, like, this is he's expressing his own opinion about what men are, and what a surprise! It's incredibly negative. You don't think that Conan's father you think he wanted to teach his kid that he could trust no one except his sword? Do you think he wanted to do
Well,
that? That was an act of love to try to equip his kid to survive. Okay.
It's okay. I gotta be clear though. I did skip past stuff, and he does go into what toxic masculinity is not, and he's very. This is important. This goes back to what I was saying before we started. The people making these videos now, we've gone from students making videos essentially to academics making videos. This guy is a teacher. He says so in the video. So he's not he's very careful in how he prepares his argument.
Marina, shut up. He's not Megan McKay. He's not a bedroom feminine.
Right. No, he's very careful in how he builds his argument. So we have to make counter arguments based on that. And
well,
even
then I would say that this exercise is sort of futile. Because this is all I can say is that if he's an academic and he's using Conan the Barbarian as evidence of anything, he's a pretty shit poor academic.
Well, I agree.
Like, seriously.
I agree.
It doesn't matter what arguments he made before this. This is his evidence. You fail automatically. This is not evidence, sir. Okay. This is not evidence.
Well, let me play this other little clip real quick.
As men, when the term toxic masculinity is used, it is not an assertion that men are naturally violent. It is also not an assertion that all aspects of masculinity are naturally toxic. Confronting toxic elements of masculinity often runs into the problem of misunderstanding the concept or ignoring the concept for fear of self-reflection. And this has made defining what toxic masculinity is not as important as defining what it is.
I just wanted to be fair and sort of like show that he's criticizing behavior as toxic, not men as toxic. And this is something that he tries to repeat over and over. So he's talking about toxic behavior. Now, the counter argument I would make to this, though, is that in his thing about Conan the Barbarian, yes, I know that he's using a fantasy film to make a point. I think that that's on purpose, and I think it's because it's actually pretty effective on normies that like watching movies. Like this is how they get into people's heads. They always, they use stuff that's popular with the average person, and then they spin it so that they can talk about the shit that they want to talk about.
Okay, but like nobody who watches Last of the Mohicans thinks Magua is the epitome of masculinity. Nobody thinks Magua is where the way men should behave. Nobody, including other men. It's one of the most popular. Like, I know men. And if I know men, I know that there are two movies that seem to come up over and over and over and over again with men, right? In terms of sort of speaking to their masculinity. One of them is the 13th Warrior. As much as it was panned by critics, right? As much as it was panned by them, it was a paean to male bravery, male courage, male self-sacrifice, men being comrades with other men, all of those things, right? Right? Against something that is outside of the normal human experience, right? So something that is completely alien, this weird freaking cult, right? Nobody thought that the Eaters of the Dead, right?
Were
those
good examples of men.
Were good examples of men. Everybody thought that the men who were willing to put their lives on the line, right, and die for the cause of protecting humanity. Every man that I've ever talked to has said that was, and the getting over the xenophobic aspects of things, right? Like you have this Arab guy who finds himself in Norse country, right? And joining forces and learning the language and all of these, and learning how to communicate with these guys and learning how to relate to them and cooperate with them and become friends, and all of, like, it speaks to every aspect of positive masculinity. It's one of the most favorite freaking movies of most of the men that I talk to. The other one is Last of the Mohicans. And what do you have? You have the sneaky, nasty, devious Frenchman, right? You have the arrogant, freaking asshole British officer, right? Webb, right? You have all of these men that you don't like because they are not, they don't behave the way men should behave, right? And then you have Uncas, you have Nathaniel, and you have Chingachgook, right? You have those three noble men, right, who are willing to die for other men, to die for their beliefs, to die for their people, to die for their women,
die for complete strangers, even
to die for complete strangers, right? But who are not sentimental. They are not sentimental. They stay as they lay, right? We're not going to bury them. They stay as they lay, right? And they were not strangers to me.
Interestingly enough, about 13th Warrior, really quick, the leader of the Eaters of the Dead was a woman. She was they worshipped her, and they actually did everything for her, interestingly enough. And the leader of the Vikings was like the manliest guy in the whole fucking movie. It was actually kind of interesting. But
Bullseye was fucking, oh my god, I would climb that man like a fucking fire pole.
Okay, so
can I just want to get in here,
and
just sort of given an unless I'm just annoying everyone, but
no,
what I'm seeing typically, if this is what's happening, he's essentially pointing the villains to the people that everybody, and men in particular, regard as the villains of a situation, to say that is what other men look to. And I think actually that reflects more on his beliefs and his xenophobia for other men, which is really ironic when he says, well, when I talk about toxic masculinity, people push back because of lack of self-reflection. Well, dude, I mean, sir, professor, dude, guy, sir, a lot of what you're saying is patently false. You don't point to the villains of a piece to say that this is what men think, like feminists seem to love to use Gaston as an example of I guess what men think is good in men, even though he's loathed,
a villain. Yeah.
Then he's the villain. And this doesn't speak, the fact that you have to say that other men identify with villains suggests to me that you yourself have some
villains
really
written by men. Villains written by men.
Unexamined issues towards other men, that really you have some unexamined xenophobia towards other men. because you're painting their thought processes and their emotions and their interests and their moral understanding in the most negative way possible. And that's why people don't like your term toxic masculinity, because they recognize exactly what you're doing. You're just engaging in one of the most toxically masculine pieces of behavior, which is something that is associated with masculinity, and it is what I would say. I wouldn't call it toxic. I would just say it is
Throwing
a
other
thing.
men under the bus.
Throwing other men on the bus and engaging in absolutely vindictive, venomous levels of xenophobia towards
Of
other
one
men.
good man syndrome.
You
One
are
good man.
expressing.
I am
You
the
are
one like this.
expressing
This is
xenophobia. This guy is expressing xenophobia of other men. He uses the term toxic masculinity. He might as well say, I don't like other men. I think that they're icky. And they might get into my women and have sex with them. And I don't like that.
well, like it really boils down to, like, you know, there was a reason I did those story time with Cenk videos, right? That, you know, Cenk's grandpappy was the one good man who would have given women the vote, right? You know, Cenk's pappy was, you know, the one good man that would have freed the women from the baby mills, right? You know, by giving them their birth control pills, right? You know, this was like this is essentially what I came up against when I did my interview with Cenk, was essentially he could not wrap his head around the idea that there were women, lots of women, the majority in, you know, going back to 1895, the vast majority of women opposed having the imposition of the vote foisted upon them, right? They didn't want the responsibility of the vote, right? And that there were men in government who supported women's suffrage, right? That there were lots of men in government who supported women's suffrage. In 1910, the suffragettes in Britain had a majority of support in Parliament for in the all male Parliament for women's suffrage, right? The suffragists just kept refusing to give them bills that they could actually freaking vote for, right? Because they only wanted to enfranchise wealthy white women. But what you had was a situation where, you know, there were plenty of men in favor of women's suffrage, plenty of women, the vast majority of women up until just 10 years maybe before women got the vote, opposing it, right? So you're looking at, okay, so the government is supposed to force upon the majority of women something that they don't want, right? Is that what they're supposed to do, right? And he answered to me, oh yeah, and women just love the burqa and blah 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, a lot of women fucking do. You know why? Because it equalizes. Yeah, they don't have to buy wrinkle creams, and they don't have to buy cosmetics, and every woman is equally as attractive as the next one. It's body positivity, right? Only by burqa rather than
Wait, I thought that's you don't even bother with that. Just say, are you an Islamophobe?
yeah. Well, you know, it's like I'm just like, I'm sorry, but it's like you're looking at a complex situation and you're breaking it down to like all men didn't want women to have the vote, and all women wanted to have the vote, and men kept it from them unjustly, and the whole time from the dawn of recorded human history, all men had the vote, right? And all this crap, right? But he could not envision that that maybe more men maybe some point in the history of women's suffrage, more men wanted women's suffrage than women did.
Of course
He
not. But
could not accept that. And that if women didn't want suffrage, it was because they'd been brainwashed by men.
okay. Yeah, and you know why it is that they can't accept that? That throughout most of human history, men have wanted an equal partner. Not a harridan, but an equal partner. You know, he can't accept it because of his own unexamined xenophobia towards other men. It's the same xenophobia that caused black men to be lynched. Same xenophobia that started, Jewish men being persecuted during during the Weimar Republic, you know, or the yeah. And I mean, it's the same kind of xenophobia that's behind all of the like a significant portion of the racism, the homophobia, and all of the persecution of minority and marginalized groups of men. Xenophobia. And it's the same xenophobia that this professor is vomiting out right now. Well, with toxic masculinity. It's not toxic masculinity. It has nothing to do with toxic masculinity. He's just basically saying, I'm xenophobic towards other men, and I'm going to do its tongue and dance and pretend that it's scientific-y. And yeah, there, I'm going to excuse my own xenophobia towards other men. That's what this guy is doing, because he is not being honest about what men appreciate, what men want. And he's basing he's basing masculine norms on science that's based on like 5 women and 3-4 men. That's ridiculous. This is all a song and dance to give a scientific veneer to your xenophobia, sir. Your xenophobia towards other men.
Well, and I think too, what you have to realize too is like when you're looking at this idea of toxic masculinity, well, okay, yes. If you look at the idea of rape culture, yes, there are poor pockets of society, right? Subcultures of society that I think could reasonably be described as rape cultures, right? So prison culture, crime,
female prison guards,
juvenile
boys,
yes. Okay, just Alison,
stop. They definitely have a rape culture.
Get off your freaking female perpetrator high horse here for a moment, right? We're talking about men here, and we're talking about toxic masculinity. So we're talking about prisons. We're talking about crime culture, gang culture, stuff like that. Well, you know, who are the people who are the men who are most likely to end up in prison and to end up, inducted into gangs, right? It's men without fathers. So patriarchy as it existed prior to feminism, right? Shielded boys and young men from those very things. It actually prevented those things, right? Fathers taught their sons, right? Respect your mother. Paul Elam once said to me, you know, like one of the things that I remember most growing up was that the one thing that would get me on the bad side of my dad was if I disrespected my mother, right? Okay, so you have father's involvement, right? Patriarchy. That is by definition patriarchy, right? The concept of fatherhood, patriarchy. Okay? And you had that, and you had fathers acting as role models toward their sons. And we see this xenophobia that you're talking about, this masculine xenophobia. We see it not just in terms of men of other cultures or other subcultures. We also see it in terms of men of the past. I read an interesting article by a historian about her book. Well, by a journalist reporting on a historian's book, right? And this historian, she was writing about how the Victorian dad may have been the original new dad, right? And one of the things that this historian had described in her book was that, you know, she's looking at memoirs and diaries and stuff, journals of working class people raised during the Victorian era, and she's like, they all have fond memories of their fathers. Their fathers were, you know, even going all the way down to like the most poor working class people, their fathers were involved. Their fathers were devoted to them. Their fathers were, even if they had alcohol problems, even if they had anger problems, there were still more fond memories than bad memories of their fathers. Their fathers still cared about them. Their fathers still tried to prepare them for life, teach them things, do hands-on parenting, all of that stuff, right? And so she's essentially looking at it like, okay, so maybe the original new dads were the Victorian fathers. Well, I'm thinking, well, maybe we could go back and look at diaries and memoirs from like 300 years prior to that, and we'd probably find that those dads were the original new dads, right?
All the way back to the Roman Empire, probably.
That's right. You know, like you could probably find that all of these dads are the original new dads, but that there is a dynamic, right, among the upper classes to derogate the working class, right, and describe them as in need of reform, and the primary target, right, the most vulnerable target when derogating the working class is the working class father, right, who does not do enough for his wife and his children, right?
Like Conan's dad.
Yeah.
Well,
Or
except
or
Conan's
or
dad died trying to
or
protect his
prepare
family.
or prepares them for the world in not an upper crust enough way.
I mean, why didn't Conan's dad teach Conan which spoon to use for
That's right.
for
That's
dessert
right. You know,
versus the soup? Like
yeah.
why didn't he teach him what it means when you're placed below the salt shaker instead of above it? Like why didn't he teach him how to do elocution and you know why I totally understand this professor now. Like
Yeah, no.
why wasn't Conan taught the sensibilities, the upper crust sensibilities that he believes make up a true man? Oh
Oh,
God.
it's like Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws governing husbands and wives, right? He said that essentially, he said, you know, although historically men have been allowed to beat their wives, right? And these days, some of the lower classes still claim their right to that ancient law. Okay, some of the lower among us, right? We, in the enlightened age of Charles II, believe that women have the right to freedom from violence and restraint from their husbands and the security of the peace against their husbands. So we of the upper classes and we of this enlightened age are much better. We're much better than the lower classes of today and those men all through history who we will diss now, right? So it's essentially, and I'm looking at it like, because I went and somebody sent me a freaking a thing, because I was talking about divorce and stuff like that, and all of these sort of marital laws, right? And somebody sent me a write up. It was, you know, including lengthy excerpts of a divorce case that a woman brought against her husband in Italy in the 1400s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she alleged he was cruel. He was not an adulterer, mind you. And the marriage had been consummated. And in Italy at the time, you needed to get permission from the Catholic Church to divorce, and they weren't going. Divorce was really not a thing in the Catholic Church. Annulment was, as long as the marriage hadn't been consummated, but divorce was really not something that they ever wanted to do. Right. So she alleged to this panel of Catholic priests, bishops, I guess, or cardinals, that her husband was cruel. He deprived her of food. He let her go hungry. He didn't buy her clothes suitable to her station. Right. They were fairly well to do. When she asked for these things, he would fly into rages and yell and shout, verbally abuse her, and occasionally would hit her. Right, and he demanded of her a level of subservience that she found undignified. Right, and what did the Catholic Church do? Well, it didn't give her a divorce. And that's a horrific thing. Oh my goodness. They did not give her the divorce that she wanted. Well, what did they do? Right? They said, okay, well, here's the thing. You're going to set up a household outside of the shared household. You will set it up at his expense. You will have servants and everything you need in the style to which you have become accustomed. And it will all be paid for by him. And also, we grant you a security of the peace against your husband, so he cannot come anywhere near you or bother you. But we can't grant you a divorce.
But effectively she got a divorce.
The only thing about the difference between what happened and the divorce is that she was not free to remarry again, but neither was he.
Huh. Okay, so yeah, this is all very like the behavior that we're seeing with what you're saying, Karen, of men looking at the behavior of other men historically, and now this guy looking at the behavior of men currently, is it, like I said, stems out of this xenophobia towards other men, this belief that other men are up to something, that they're evil, that they don't have the same values that you have as a man. And if you really think about it, that xenophobia is like it's on a spectrum with homophobia. So this guy, I wonder what his like there is a relationship there. You have this xenophobia towards other men, and then a repulsion towards any kind of affection between these other men because they're demonic. So any kind of affection, any kind of learning, any kind of transference of culture between men becomes distinctly disgusting to you. And I wonder if that's where this particular academic's where his headspace is in. So I mean, also racism is an aspect of the same kind of xenophobia that he's talking about. I mean, it's I think we should watch some more, perhaps.
Yes.
It's been an hour and 10 minutes. We're
Okay,
past
but I want to get into the
Conan stuff.
Conan's sexual exploits.
Okay.
Wasn't he like bred like a livestock or something?
He was a slave, and then he was a gladiator, and then he was given women as rewards, like when he was successful enough. We'll get into that later. It's almost like in like a swords and sorcery, sort of fantasy setting that was written by like a guy who was doing pulp books. It's like that doesn't reflect like reality at all. Yeah, it's like a whole other world. But the one other thing I wanted to say about this too is that men don't model their masculinity on other men willy-nilly. Men model their masculinity on other men that exhibit either noble traits that they wish they had, that they can admire, like they actually stand as a model for something, or more often they do it based on men who are successful with women. They model themselves after those men. Nobody looks at a homeless guy in the street and says, I want to be like that guy. They look at the guys that are like really popular with women and they say, I want to be like that guy because I want access to women at that level. And the only way they can do it is by doing what women like. And so one of the main things that's important to point out here, when these people talk about toxic masculinity, notice that they always leave women's part to play out of that discussion. It's always something that men are doing to men. Not true. Not true. If you don't have like women as part of the potential, we can call it a reward. I think that's kind of it's more like a goal, I guess you could say. If that doesn't exist, as the incentive of attracting someone, not just getting someone, attracting a woman that wants to be with you because of who you are, that is what men want. If that's not a part of it, then we can't talk about how men don't socialize that. That's something that women do because they sit there and when they pick a man, they're telling other men, this is what I like. And they're telling other men what they should be like. So if you like, look at the hood, okay? Here in the hood where I live, there are thuggish dudes that get with attractive women. Those women pick those guys because in that culture, that urban culture where people are relatively poor and violence is like useful, they select men for that. And so other men that want women that live in the same area, they apply those traits so they can attract women. So this isn't toxic masculinity, is not something that's reinforced by men. Most of it is women, other women, and their choices. So, all right.
I want to just add something to it because there's another reason why this could be an expression of xenophobia. He could actually be trying to tear other men down in order to make himself appear to be more attractive to women.
For sure.
And that's an aspect of that xenophobia.
Absolutely.
You tear other men down in order to be more attractive.
Yeah, he actually has a disdain for general positive masculinity because he thinks that, well, you know what, we don't have time. Let's keep going.
Let's go.
In this iconic scene, Conan is asked what is best in life.
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women.
What Conan is describing here actually fits quite well with the description of the values of toxic masculinity.
Okay, and that would be the values of how many men? Like Genghis Khan? Not even Genghis Khan.
Conan's a very common man. There were lots of Conans around in Conan's time. It's not like he was a unique person that like was worthy of having books written about him or anything.
Jesus Christ! Like how many men throughout history were world conquerors, sir? And to be honest, like a lot of them were very much more interesting than you're presenting. Why don't we use men who actually existed rather than somebody's? Let's face it, the guy had particular fantasies, and he had a right to them, but they were his fantasies, and there was sexual components to them. So, I mean, if we're going to judge all men by Conan the Barbarian, or just use him as an example, but I take your guys' meaning that he wants to make this accessible to people by using an example that everybody relates to.
I think
but he's using this too broadly.
I think what he's avoiding is looking at the hero's journey.
Yeah, and he's also avoiding, let's look at actual men who are world conquerors throughout history. They're a lot more interesting than you might imagine.
Yeah,
They had a lot more interesting sensibilities than you might imagine.
But let's look at the hero's journey in this case, right? Okay, so he essentially he is the ultimate and here's the thing too, right? He is the ultimate romance hero, Conan, right? He is a barbarian, right? He is strong, he's powerful, he's brutal in many ways. He shows himself capable of defending what he feels belongs to him, whether in the ownership sense or in the familial relationship sense.
He's also sexually carnal and
sexually carnal.
Look, I just want to say this before, because I know you're going to go on. In my opinion, there's nothing about that line. There's nothing about that line that's negative. That famous line, crush your enemies, watch them be driven before you, and hear the lamentations of the women. I don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing, and I think that him making the statement that that is an example of toxic masculinity is wrong on its face, because I don't think that's a negative line.
Okay, let me translate Conan's line into this professor's lingo. To crush
your
toxic
enemies.
masculinity, crush toxic masculinity, identify male privilege, and hear the lamentation of the handmaidens. There you go, Professor. It's exactly your credo.
There you go. Yeah, no, but what we're seeing though in the movie is the hero's journey from somebody who's essentially obsessed with sex, with fighting, with dominance, with all of these things. He meets a woman who is his equal in every way. That woman in that movie was his equal in every way. She does not tame him, but she becomes partners with him and changes the focus of his, what he's all about, right? So now he's not about merely crushing some enemy who is his enemy for who knows why, right? See his enemy driven before him because that is an expression of his dominance, and hearing the lamentation of the women because he has no regard for women, right? We see the change in Conan, right? When he, experiences the influence of this woman and learns more about the world in which he lives, where he becomes more compelled towards justice, more compelled towards freedom, more compelled towards, liberating a population who are in the thrall of something evil, right? So this is literally a hero's journey from what this guy describes as toxic masculinity, which is just mindless violence and aggression and dominance, to something much more nuanced and much more complex and positive, right?
Much more reflective of actual world conquerors throughout history.
Yes, absolutely. And so what you're looking at is he's like essentially saying, okay, this toxic mass, this is the way, toxic mass. Yeah, but okay, yeah, maybe there are some men out there who are toxically masculine in this way, right? But I think most of them, all the way from the time that they're in their teens, right? And I'm using my son as an example, right? My 16-year-old. Most of them are kind of a mixed bag of stuff that could be considered toxic and stuff that could be considered virtuous, and they tend toward the virtuous particularly if they have a masculine role model, right, or a number of them, right? They like this is what you're looking at is a story of somebody who was brutalized, became subhuman as a result, and then regained his humanity. That is the hero's journey in this story, right?
So
And
essentially, this guy has
all,
not
all
just
this guy
slandered.
wants to focus on is the period in which Conan is can be categorized as subhuman.
Okay, so here's what I'm getting now. So not only is he using a fantasy novel, and we can get, okay, fair enough. He wants to show a trope that people can relate to. Not only is he using it, he's distorting it
Yeah.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
denying its actual message in order to deliver his message, which is man bad. And I wasn't kidding when I said that basically he's saying what Conan was saying when he was subhuman. To crush your enemy, see him driven before him, and hear the lamentations of your women. This is this guy's credo because he's operating from xenophobia towards other men. He wants to crush their masculinity, see them submit to him, and maybe he doesn't want to hear the lamentations. Well, he certainly wants to hear the lamentations of any women who actually liked those men.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you also look at it too,
most
right? Like
women.
the idea that that this is like a he's focusing on this one period, right? The bitter period, right? The period, the red pill rage period, if you will, right? That men sometimes have to go through before they actually actualize, before they drag themselves back down into the universe of the real, is what I call it, right? The universe of the real, right? So you have an idealism, right, that is brought down and crushed and destroyed, uh and you end up with this bitterness about everything, and the nihilism, right? And you're essentially using a movie that describes, and what was the end of the movie, right? The end of the movie shows him sitting on his throne, right, saying, he justly ruled his kingdom for however many more years, right? He was, he was honored, he was just, he was considered, all of this stuff, right? So you're essentially describing a journey through darkness and into light, right? A journey through the darkness of human depravity and into the light of, human nobility, or human virtue, as just like, oh, all this is about is toxic masculinity. And I'm just like, I'm sorry, but like, and I watched this video and I don't think he even addressed any of that journey up into the light.
No.
He describes the execution of Thulsa Doom.
Yeah, he cherry picks it.
All of this stuff as equally toxic,
Yeah.
equally toxic in its, in its toxic masculinity as the, hear the lamentation of the women, all of that stuff, right? So you look at this I could apply this same analysis, right, to the Terminator, right, and to the character Sarah Connor.
Yeah, sure.
And I could say this is absolutely toxic femininity or toxic something, evil.
It's ridiculous.
Sarah Connor's an evil character,
All right.
Because at one point she was,
Well, she was appropriately feminine, weak, and
self-absorbed and kind of
she just
naive
saw
and
things in terms of how things were acting upon her. And then at some point she realized, well, you know what? I got to pull up my socks and start. If I want to survive, I got to start to look at what I can do, not what I can't do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
This is why I say I think this speaks more to this guy's xenophobia than it does to any actual real. And it's not a scientific analysis. It would be a narrative analysis, but even as a narrative analysis, it gets an F because it only takes one part of the narrative that applies to his point or buttresses his xenophobia towards other men. Again, it's the same kind of xenophobia that led to homophobia and racism and anti-Semitism. So congratulations, guy. So he's using all of this narrative analysis just to buttress and justify his xenophobia towards other men.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And it leaves out, he consistently leaves women's part to play out of every single point he tries to make about toxic masculinity.
Yeah,
He leaves women out. He genders behaviors that are not unique to men, while also leaving out the fact that feminists themselves want women to have the traits that they consider toxic in men. They want women to be like that, but when men are like that, they shouldn't be like that. Honestly.
Yeah, well, the cherry on the shit sundae is that he does all of this. He's acting out of his own unexamined xenophobia to other men, which is why he's cherry picking the world, basically, because it's not just, I guarantee it's not just Conan that he's cherry picking.
Mhm.
It's his own experiences. It's the entire corpus of literature and everything and science. And he does all of that because of his unexamined xenophobia. And the cherry on the shit sundae, as he turns around and anybody says, dude, I think that you're missing some stuff here. Anybody who pushes back on his analysis, he calls that they are not willing to examine themselves.
There you go.
Oh,
All
goodness.
All right.
Shall we go to the after show?
Yeah.
No, moving on. I want to talk about Conan's sex.
All right.
But maybe we could do that in the after show because it's already like an hour and a half in.
I'm not going into the after show. Let's go. Let's do it.
All right, so I'm gonna jump up to hear the lamentations of the women. Then, right? That's the because he basically breaks down each part of that saying, and that goes into the sex.
I want the part where Conan is gifted with a woman to have sex with.
Yeah, I think that's coming up here. All right.
Thing Conan says, hear the lamentations of the women. Okay, so let's talk about that. Conan, encountering women, mindlessly calls them sluts. In another scene...
Yeah, but those were actually prostitutes. So, he wasn't lying. He was describing what was there. Those weren't just women. Those were literally harlots hanging out.
Conan is gifted a woman who clearly does not want to have sex with Conan. Toxic masculinity tells men that they should be prepared for sex at any...
Yeah.
Pause. Okay, you know another woman who clearly did not want to have sex with a man in pop culture?
And anybody in any romance novel?
Much more recently than this film. Right? Jason Momoa. Khal Drogo.
Oh, yeah. Game of Thrones, right. What's her name? Khaleesi?
Yeah. Daenerys Khaleesi did not want to have sex with him. And he was gifted to him by her brother. And wouldn't you know it, every vagina in the vicinity of that scene, whether it was in the book or in the movie, right? Or in the TV show, every single vagina in the vicinity of that scene of their wedding night, right? And the consummation of their marriage, every vagina had women slipping off their fucking chairs. Every single fucking one.
It was Viagra Falls.
Oh God, it was just unfucking believably hot. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, it just was. It speaks to something in the female psyche. Here is this man. He is powerful. He is brutal. He is brooding. He is uncommunicative, except to you, right? He's harsh to everyone except to you. To you, he's a little bit gentler. He's a little bit more tender. He's a little bit less dominant and frightening, right? And he caresses you gently, and he doesn't so much care about your consent, at least not at the beginning of the whole thing. But you can tame him. You can tame him. You can bend him to your will. He can be the spear by which your will is enacted if you can just capture his imagination and his affection, right? Absolutely fucking seductive and intoxicating to women. Absolutely 100%. Right? And it is that that puts the lie to the idea that toxic masculinity is imposed on men by other men. Because you know what? It wasn't men who were freaking creaming their pants when Khal Drogo consummated his marriage with Daenerys.
Also, the woman that was gifted to Conan in the Conan movie, he was actually really nice to her. Because it was the first time
gentle.
He was very gentle, because it was the first time I think that he had been with a woman. Because he was a slave up until that point.
He was extremely like, okay, I'm going to play horse whisperer to you, which is the way Khal Drogo did it, right? I'm this big, huge, scary man, but I'm going to be gentle with you, and I'm not going to be cruel to you. And you didn't choose this, but I want to convince you to go along with it anyway. It's the absolute woman's fantasy. This man could rape me, and he wants me enough that he would rape me, but he won't rape me because he would rather have me desire him.
Well, there you go. So, are we done? Should we go? There was one other thing I wanted to show one clip while we were live and respond to it. It was just one.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so let me set it up though. So
and then we have to answer the freaking super chats.
Yeah, then we have to read the super chats. So he goes on to describe this goes into a broader discussion about vertical hierarchies in general and how they are created by the patriarchy and how they are damaging to men and, of course, even more so damaging to women. And then he goes on to talk about how people defend these hierarchies. So I wanted to play a bit about this.
Held together by force. Capitalism, for example, is maintained
because of course we have to talk about capitalism
that exploits workers.
I wonder where he's going with
these
that.
Hierarchies claim that they are natural and that makes them somehow unavoidable. Of course, no hierarchical system has always existed, which disproves this. And even if it were natural, something being natural does not make it automatically better. Indoor plumbing is not natural, but we wouldn't give that up. It's not a coincidence that those who defend the existence of these hierarchies, whether based in economic...
Stop, dog.
Wait. I want to. This is the bit.
Okay, I just want to express something.
Okay, well, it's just mute yourself because your dog's going nuts. Finish up.
Indoor plumbing is not natural, but we wouldn't give it up. Yeah, you know why? Because revulsion. The feeling of revulsion towards human excrement is natural. That's why we have indoor plumbing.
Good point. Let's finish this, Brian.
Let's finish this.
They're based in economics, race, gender, etc. are also those...
Oh, it got cut off, his little point that I wanted to respond to. Here we go.
It's not a coincidence that those who defend the existence of these hierarchies, whether based in economics, race, gender, etc., are also those who benefit most from them.
Okay, that's fucking bullshit, and that's the thing I need to respond to, because he's trying to say that the people who tend to defend hierarchies are the ones that are that stand to benefit from the hierarchies as they exist. I am a Hispanic male that was born poor, that lives in Chicago, the most corrupt, in a city in the most corrupt state in the country, and I am riddled with diseases, okay? I am not benefiting from this idea, but I could tell you that because I understand this now, I have a lot less bitterness in me than I did many years ago when I thought that the reason why my life was hard was because other people who were benefiting from these hierarchies were taking something from me. And so this pisses me off because it acts as though people like me don't exist, that everyone only acts in their best interest at the cost of other people. When I say that I want to do stuff and I care about men's issues, it's not because I stand to benefit. Hell, if anything, I've been pretty safe from most of those issues. I was never circumcised. I didn't have to go through a divorce. I didn't lose my kids. You know, these things didn't happen to me, but that doesn't mean that I don't see that they're a problem that I should be talking about for people who have or may suffer from those down the line. So, like, this pisses me off because this guy thinks he knows the kinds of people who are making these arguments and that they're doing it for the same self-serving reasons that he does it. Because you see, I think that he hates hierarchies because he can't compete in them. And I think that that's where this resentment comes from.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really ironic because technically he's a professor. He's on top of a hierarchy.
Yeah, but he's not very popular with the women, I can guarantee you. And that at its heart, that is one of the primary motivations of people, whether it's conscious or unconscious, whether it is direct or indirect, whether it's proximal or distal, right? One of the primary drivers of human behavior, probably the primary, the preeminent driver of human behavior is what got people laid, right? What got people laid in the past, right? And you know, because the sum total of what got people laid in the past is you, right? Going back before people, what got our ancestors, our you know, like our common ancestor with chimpanzees laid in the past, that informs our behavior. What got bacteria, well, not bacteria, but slugs or, you know, whatever, our most distant common ancestor, right, with other species, like when we developed sexual, not just sexual reproduction, right? Like slugs are sexually reproduced, but they don't have sex, right? They don't have male and female, right? But when you're looking at when sex differentiation became a thing in the animal kingdom, stop. And even in the plant kingdom, what is the primary driver of that? Success in getting laid, success in passing on your genes, right? Everything. The fact that you feel thirsty when you're dehydrated, the fact that you feel hungry when you lack calories, the fact that, like, if you didn't feel those things, or if your ancestors didn't feel those things, they would not have lived long enough to get laid and pass on their genes, right? So you're looking at this. There was this incredibly interesting episode of House, right, where this girl, this young woman, right, she had to set her watch on a timer to let her know when to urinate because she could not feel anything remotely resembling physical pain, right, including her bladder telling her that it was time to pee, right, and that she had to go, right? And this is an extremely, extremely rare disorder. And the reason that it's extremely rare is it got selected out of the gene pool because nobody who had it, right, outside of the modern world, nobody who had it lived long enough to reproduce. It's why freaking leprosy is so dangerous.
Yeah.
It kills people. It's not because it's an infection. It's because the infection makes you incapable of feeling pain, right? And so then you end up with secondary infections. You end up with staph infections and all kinds of things that can kill you and deprive you of your limbs. That's why it's dangerous, right? And so you're looking at this thing where everything. The only thing that absolutely 100% contributed to your existence is the ability of your parents to live long enough to reproduce, and all of their parents and grandparents and everything else, right? The unbroken line, the unbroken chain of reproduction, right? Living long enough to reproduce and then actually doing it. That is the only fucking thing. It is not sufficient, but it is necessary, right, to your existence today. And we're looking at it like, oh yeah, no, women's sexual choices don't really matter, and women's sexual preferences don't really matter. It's all just men dictating the whole thing, and you know, these hierarchies, they're just arbitrary, right? You know, like,
The assumption is also that there was a point where there wasn't hierarchies. What?
I know. Like the hierarchy, the original hierarchy is the hierarchy of two. It is two levels: those who reproduce and those who do not.
But this is
That's
ridiculous.
the original fucking hierarchy.
Does he honestly think the hierarchy didn't exist before capitalism? Does he know about the Bronze Age?
I
No,
honestly
does he
no.
ever say-
I don't know, but I don't think so. I think
No,
he
but
does talk
he
about it
says-
like it's something that men built. That's what it is. He says that men built it, and women just had to deal with what men built. Men built vertical hierarchies. Women didn't have anything to do with that at all.
It's so stupid. It's so stupid. Like in his concept that because the hierarchies that exist today, right? So hierarchies that are corrupted by nepotism and cronyism and corporatism and all kinds of things like that, right? Corruption in politics and all of these things, because these hierarchies didn't exist as they exist today. And they probably didn't always exist as they exist today, right? Because, well, you know, a hunter-gatherer group of 150, hierarchy is not scalable to a freaking 360 million person country, right? It's not scalable in that way. You can't have that hierarchy, a hierarchy in the family where the father is, you know, kind of the last word on things. The mother is the advisor, you know, the chief advisor. The children are subordinate, right? And the servants as well, right, are subordinate. Those kind of hierarchies can't exist in a scalable sense the way they do in those small things, those small groups, right? The way sort of a version of communism can exist in a group, in an extended family, right? Where I don't dictate to my newborn, I'm only going to give you as much breast milk as you earn today through your productivity, right? Those kinds of, you know, just kind of setting aside the hierarchy or flattening of the hierarchy, making it a little bit more communal, right? All of those things, right? They're not scalable to civilizations. They're not. They're just not. And the fact
Well,
that
I mean, technically, the Bronze Age did actually have a communistic system in which the palace kept track of all transactions. But I think he would be
you can't
incredibly
expect
shattered to
the
learn.
The
But
palace.
he'd be shattered to learn that the Bronze Age was an unbelievably hierarchical and stratified society held
And
together
brutal.
by brutality,
Yeah,
which
and
is
brutal. And so you're looking,
describes communism.
you're looking at this, you're looking at the situation where, because the exact form that our hierarchies take these days maybe wasn't always how hierarchies were, right? Therefore, hierarchy itself is something that isn't necessary and is not ubiquitous. It's not natural. And oh, even if it is natural, right, that doesn't mean it's good. Well, I'm sorry. Nature abhors a power vacuum. If you flatten a hierarchy, you're essentially flattening it at the bottom, right? Everyone is equally miserable and equally poor. And what you do is you make a hierarchy that is so steep you can't even see it, right? That's really what it is. It's not a pyramid anymore. It's not like a shape. It's like one line horizontally and one line vertically. That's really what it is when you try and actually eliminate hierarchy altogether, because nature will not tolerate that. And what you will get is like a fraction of 1% at the very tippy top, and everybody else is living in misery in the muck.
Okay. And that sort of actually defines the Bronze Age. This the very stratified, very much held together by resource, like a exploitation, absolute exploitation of one resource, and also incredible brutality. So, and that was a communistic system. Everything was shared in common, or at least the palace owned everything, which is really the way communism ends up. But when we look at capitalism, what's interesting about capitalism is it doesn't have that kind of a level of hierarchy. And also, if you just look at the market, you'll see how hierarchies form and then they dissolve. So there's a lot more fluctuation when you're talking about capitalistic hierarchies. You'll have an organization that rises and then it falls. You'll have another organization. How many
MySpace,
companies?
everybody.
Yeah, how many companies have risen up, created a hierarchy, and then dissolved, disappeared under the forces, market forces? And you know what's interesting is the reason why that happens is because the ultimate arbiter of at least free market capitalism is market forces. It's the individual choices of the individual consumers. So in many ways, free
Of whom
market
are women.
capitalism, free market capitalism is a way of removing defunct or non-functional hierarchies, which is why you see such an amount of fluctuation in capitalism. So I'm not exactly, because it's really interesting for me to hear him talk about capitalism as if it's somehow more hierarchical than communism. Like, no, sir, you're wrong. It's far more. Communism is another thing about communism is you have to have gotten your moral framework exactly right, because once the government is in place, it ain't going anywhere. So its morals are going to be what's stamped in perpetuity until somebody goes into some violent revolution to get rid of it. Because capitalism, if you look at the history of civil rights under capitalism, what happens is a community develops a sense that, they're hard done by, there's a problem. They get their resources, their capital resources together. They prove to the rest of the world that they actually will invest in their own issue monetarily. And then they start to see progress in terms of getting the rest of this capitalistic society to recognize their moral concerns. And that's an evolution that goes on. In capitalist society, we can evolve our morals because of that flexibility of hierarchies coming up, dissolving when they become defunct, and then rising again. And that's because nobody controls it. There's no one person in power. You want communism? Inevitably, you will get one group of people in absolute power, violently subjugating everyone else, because you have removed the impersonal forces. And yeah, there is corruption in capitalism, but corruption isn't a flaw in communism. It is communism. That is what it is. If you define corruption as the absolute rulership and self-interest of one group of people and the absolute brutal subjugation of everyone else, that is communism. That is corruption in capitalism. That is a flaw that capitalism can have, but doesn't always.
Well,
So capitalism allows for the creation of hierarchy and the dissolution of hierarchy when it's no longer functional. It allows for the evolution of morals. And no, it is not fucking perfect. Nobody said it was.
No, nobody ever said it was. And like one of the best quotes that I've ever heard was that communism doesn't work because it depends 100% on human virtue, and capitalism works because it actually depends on human vice.
Well, I've disagreed with you on that. I think that communism doesn't work because it actually depends on a particular form of human vice, which is the desire to dominate.
No. What I'm saying is communism in theory always fails because it depends on all human beings to be virtuous, right? And that's not something that is realistic, right? Capitalism understands that humans are not always virtuous, right? So it gives them incentives to be virtuous and it gives them disincentives to be villains, essentially, right? Whereas communism, it essentially relies on every single member of the society to be virtuous at all times. And no, you're just not. That is it. That's like, we're going to create a power vacuum, and we're going to depend on there being no human who's going to pull a gun and take advantage of that.
Yeah,
And
no, I get what you're saying now. Whereas with capitalism, like communism, the only way to get rid of the defunct and non-functional hierarchy is through violent revolution. Whereas with capitalism, you can just stop buying their fucking product.
there you go. And I would suggest to every freaking left winger, right? If you own a fucking smartphone, you're a hypocrite. Every hard left anti-capitalist asshole, if you own a smartphone, if you access the internet, if you use Twitter, you're a fucking hypocrite. You're a hypocrite. You're putting money in the pockets of the corporations that you hate, and the capitalists that you hate, the billionaires that you hate, that you think should not be allowed to exist, right? So, just fucking log off. Just log off. Right?
All right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay,
All
let's
right.
go into the let's.
So we're gonna go
I
into the
think
after show now.
Yeah, we're pretty
Okay.
far along here.
All right.
So-
yeah, it's fine. We can quit.
Yeah. So
Wrap it
thank you
up.
everybody for joining us. If you want to join us in the after show, please go to www.feedthebadger.com and become a subscriber. And you can talk to me, and apparently not Karen, but me and Brian and Karen on Thursdays. And yeah, hopefully you'll join us. We're probably what are we going to continue this?
Yeah, well, we can just talk to them more about this. Go back over some of the clips that we missed.
Let's go over
whatever,
the witch sex scene with Conan.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and go to the after show. Thanks, guys, for coming on. Oh, the super chats. I gotta read the super chats because we have a bunch, and you insisted I not read them. So, let me see.
my fault.
Ben gives us $2 and says it's meant to be Black Fire. Some of the vagina thing that I saw earlier. Why everyone dirty? Well, welcome to Honey Badger Radio. This must be your first time. French Honey Badger gives us $5 and says that wasn't my interpretation. This is in relation to the Big Joel thing. I thought Joel's arguments were pretty cogent, actually. Sorry for derailing, though. Well, I mean, we can get into that. I know what you're saying. I think that in a lot of ways, Sargon's response wasn't good enough, and it gave Joel a lot of like rope that he could use. But I think that Joel is disingenuous anyway. So Mr. Roboto gives us $5 and says, "Hi Badgers, perhaps in the old days men set the standard for ladies, but today it very much is the ladies themselves." I disagree. I bet it was ladies from the beginning, and I think men just went along with it. Ben for $2 says, "But promiscuity is only a male problem. Sluts? Yes, sluts are a thing. We just saw them in Conan. They do exist." Mr. Roboto gives us $2. Actually, there's evidence to show that women tend to be more promiscuous than men. I mean, obviously, they have more opportunities to be that way. Mr. Roboto gives us $2 and says, "Is there going to be a regular show Sunday now?" No, this is irregular for a Rantzerker. It just so happens that we're trying to make it work within Karen's schedule, and this is when she was available. So Hoki Bukisa gives us $4.99 and says restricting voting rights to landowners was restricting it to the tax base. It made sense. The franchise should be restricted to the tax base. I have a tendency to agree with that. I think that people who vote should be people who are very invested in the future of the country, and I think it makes sense. So I don't know if that's something we can go back to. I doubt that, but I take what you're saying. Hoki gives us another $4.99 and says everyone benefits from hierarchy, especially losers and women. Yeah, and the left is these people who supposedly want to smash hierarchies, they just create new hierarchies anyways. They're not really getting away from it, and it's interesting.
Like this guy.
Yeah,
He's
he
created
believes
moral hierarchy
he has
with himself on
hierarchies.
top.
He just wants to change it. He wants to put these masculine like men that, get all the women and they have money and they work hard and they have all these values. He wants to put them at the bottom, and he wants to put intellectual guys like himself on the top. He just wants to flip it. This is why when people say the left doesn't believe in hierarchies, yes, they do. They just believe in a reverse one. They just want to socially construct people to like them more and put them on top so they don't have to earn it. So that's what it is. They're just trying to flip it. Anyhow, I personally would rather work for it, and that's why I feel, despite the fact that I've been through so much shit as a young man. I want to work for my better life, and I feel actually much more positive than I did when I was younger, and I thought everything wasn't my fault. And this is why this shit pisses me off so much, because I know this stuff is effective, especially on poor minorities, and in particular poor minority men. So anyhow, with that said, we're going to go to the after show. I want to thank you guys for coming on. Leave us a like, give us a comment, and subscribe to the channel so that you know when we go live. And you could also join us on future live streams. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you can also get like notifications through our Discord if you become a subscriber and get on our Discord, where we actually do talk to you, except for Karen, because she hates all technology.
Yeah, and I think the notifications there tend to be more consistent than the ones on YouTube.
Are you telling me you don't hate other forms of technology?
I like Skype. I like email. I just don't like Discord. It's freaking spaghetti.
Skype, Discord is like Skype and email.
Let's
together.
go. Let's go.
Okay, yeah,
we're
let's
gonna
go. Let's go.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.